Was there a sense that some of their abuses were just arbitrary, just without cause?
Yes.
Well, why do you think that was?
Well, it's hard for me to... The Japanese had such a hatred for the Americans that they used every excuse they could to be cruel.
The brutality that different armies display in the greatest war conflicts is well known, but there are few crimes that generate as much taboo as cannibalism. Consuming the flesh of another human is a dark and depraved act that seems to belong to barbaric times long gone by. However, the Japanese army was accused of committing these atrocities during World War II. Prisoners on the Japanese front were not only tortured, enslaved, and sexually abused, but in several cases they were also consumed as a dark ritual banquet. From Indonesia to India, dozens of prisoners have their own memories of these dark acts, carried out by troops of the Empire of the Rising Sun. Today, we are going to analyze some of the most repugnant, so get ready, because this is not an episode for the weak of stomach. It is known that, as a member of the Axis and ally of the Third Reich, Japan committed some of the most extreme crimes seen on Asian lands. The archipelago's troops were as effective as they were heartless, and that was no coincidence, but rather a strategy carefully thought out by the High Command and the Emperor himself. Through blind obedience and a code of honor that encouraged sacrifice and depersonalization, they managed to transform thousands of soldiers into killing machines, but also into even worse things.
It's estimated that between 2 and 14 million civilians became victims of the Japanese army as they committed horrific atrocities in cities such as Nanking. They treated prisoners of war terribly, and there were terrifying stories and allegations levelled against them in regards to how they held prisoners inside of camps.
It is well recorded that they murdered and raped entire populations, reducing them to both labor and sexual slavery. Worse still, these actions were driven by a racist view of other nations. Japan considered itself a superior people that had the power to conquer and destroy the rest of its neighbors for the good of Asia. Although the Tokyo trials, the analog of the Nuremberg trials, managed to imprison several perpetrators, that justice was incomplete and many details were buried by history. Still, the rising sun could not be covered with one hand. One of the most savage crimes committed by the Japanese army in World War II came to light thanks to the Japanese researcher Toshiyuki Tanaka, who was surveying a series of old documents kept in Australia. There, among old papers, were testimonies and records dating back to the 1940s that spoke of horrific cases of cannibalism and consumption of human flesh in situations of extreme famine. The revelations made by Tanaka were added to the long list of atrocities committed by the archipelago during the Second World War. Although subsequent governments have made lukewarm apologies for what happened, the truth is that their actions were overshadowed by the savagery of the Third Reich. This contrast seems to have slightly cleaned up the image of the former empire, which was able to bring all its Pacific neighbors to their knees. Toshiyuki Tanaka is an academic from Fukui in Western Japan who was working in the political science department of the University of Melbourne in Australia when he discovered the documents that spoke of people devouring other people. These were usually memos written by Japanese soldiers themselves, as well as sworn statements given by Australian and Indian forces who witnessed and suffered these horrors when they were taken prisoner by the Japanese Empire on different islands throughout Southeast Asia.
They were held in tough conditions inside of a prison on the island, and they were subjected to terrible treatment. The men would be interrogated daily, and they were also beaten very badly, and they were tortured for information.
As we mentioned earlier, most of the stories talk about periods of famine caused by the incipient defeat of the Axis against the Allies. Between 1944 and mid-1945, when World War II ended, the routes for sending supplies fell one by one, isolating thousands of Japanese troops who were in remote points of Southeast Asia and Oceania. As the leader of the campaign in that theater of operations, the United States knew that by conquering and cutting off the communication routes between the areas dominated by Japan, it could greatly weaken the empire. And so it was. Soon, the Japanese soldiers found themselves plunged into misery, isolated in remote areas and without the possibility of communicating with their superiors. Given the express order not to abandon their posts, these uniformed men resorted to their last option, the consumption of prisoners in order to survive. The people were chosen at random, executed and treated like cattle that, after being slaughtered, had to be cut into pieces to facilitate cooking. But the most serious thing is that in several instances, these abominable crimes were not related to supply problems or a hostile context. While these conditions do not justify acts of such evil, it is even worse to imagine that the emperor's troops engaged in human consumption only for pleasure and due to macabre orders from their superiors. In all the forced labor centers distributed in the Pacific, similar stories are told, which resemble a horror movie more than a story of war times. Beyond the desperate measures that we mentioned previously, there are also reports of cases in which troops resorted to cannibalism not out of necessity, but as a method to strengthen the group's relationship. A sort of ritual to unite the soldiers, devouring the flesh of their enemies. According to Tanaka, it is explained that many of the cannibal soldiers were well fed and in remarkable health since they still had potatoes, rice, and fish. They were far from experiencing a moment of madness and extreme hunger, which could be considered the context of their attacks on prisoners. Research also disproves another common explanation, that of a breakdown in morale and the chain of command caused by Japan's imminent defeat by the Allies. Typically, cases of cannibalism occurred in units where there were several officers and commanders present, who gave the necessary orders to execute and devour the prisoners. That is why another possible theory emerged, that this bloody practice was used on the one hand to give a sense of overwhelming victory to the traumatized men of Japan, and on the other, to test the courage and obedience of these men. If they obeyed orders and ate another human being, it could be assumed that this subject was capable of anything for his country. At this point in the story, it is necessary to introduce you to one of the darkest figures of the Japanese Empire, General Yoshio Tachibana.
Tachibana graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1913 and had a fairly unremarkable career until 1939. He was given command of the Japanese Army's 65th Infantry Regiment prior to its participation in the Battle of Zhaoyang-Yichang against Chinese forces in Manchuria.
After his Manchurian experience, this man was in charge of his country's military operations in the Ogasawara Islands to resist the advance of the American forces. This region was affected by several air operations that in many cases culminated in the downing of American planes. This is how Tachibana and his men managed to capture several prisoners of war who were treated worse than animals. In the record signed by the general himself, there is talk of torture and extreme measures to destroy the bodies of the captured men. Among all the reported cases, the most horrendous was one known as the Chichijima incident, for which the soldier would later be harshly judged and executed for his lack of humanity. This horrifying story begins at the end of 1944, when 9 American pilots were shot down from their Grumman TBF Avengers after carrying out a coordinated attack on Chichijima. There was a long-distance radio station there that was of great strategic importance. As they fled, they were hit by Japanese fire, but survived in the Pacific waters for several hours until they reached the coast of one of the many islands in the region. Unfortunately, 8 of them were captured. The only one who managed to evade the enemy was the future President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, who was then only 20 years old. The captured American pilots thought they would be executed immediately or tortured to gather information about Allied operations. But the Japanese had a much more sinister plan in mind: to feed on their flesh. To do so, the Americans were visited by doctors who examined their bodies for possible diseases. Of course, the diners were only looking for quality raw material. What happened to the 9 pilots was kept secret until the end of the war. Once their remains and relevant documents were recovered, it was discovered that they were beaten, tortured, and mutilated before they died. Then, on the express orders of General Yoshio Tachibana, they were decapitated and consumed by the soldiers. The story of one witness in particular is sickening.
His liver and thigh were removed too. At night, the liver was pierced with bamboo sticks and cooked with soy sauce and vegetables, and served along with alcohol. It's believed that at least 4 other airmen who were executed were subjected to cannibalism, as their remains were consumed by senior staff at Chichijama's ranks.
This depraved act was taken into account when judging Tachibana and his men, who were sentenced to death by hanging, a price too low for such inhumanity. Surprisingly, they were not the only ones who carried out such perverse activities. During Tanaka's investigation, the shocking testimony of an Australian soldier was found, who recounted the moment when he found the devoured remains of former comrades. He described a horrifying mound in which some heads stood out that had been skinned, and from which hung spines without any flesh. The image was nauseating, but it allowed one to understand that the bodies had been dismembered with a purpose. It was not a massacre, but rather a dark task. Another account from an Australian officer provides a disgusting detail about the origin of the corpses that were devoured. This officer recalls that, on one occasion, he found the mutilated and consumed remains of people he had buried. In other words, not only was cannibalism practiced, but bodies that had spent the night underground were also part of the diet. A document contains the memories of a Pakistani man who had been captured by Japanese forces in Singapore and then transferred to New Guinea. There, he was placed in a forced labor camp in inhumane conditions, where excessive labor and lack of food caused daily deaths. According to his testimony, in that region, the Japanese military killed and consumed 1 prisoner per day for almost 100 days. The Pakistani even stated that some victims were dismembered and consumed while still alive, so the food was seasoned with the background of the raw materials' cries of pain. At this point, it is necessary to mention that the Indian and Pakistani people suffered directly from the onslaught of the Japanese Empire. Pakistan, India, and other Asian territories served as a sort of strategic barrier that prevented Japan and Germany from coming into contact, which would have meant an impressive strategic union. Bear in mind that India was a territory colonized by Great Britain, so from the beginning of the Second World War its inhabitants were put at the service of the fight against the Axis. In fact, the highest rates of volunteering were recorded there, but not without dichotomies. Many politicians and leaders proposed rebelling against British tyranny through a strategic union with Japan. Although this occurred marginally, it did not succeed in overcoming the superhuman effort of those Indians who repelled the advance of the Axis.
Indians were treated as barbarously by the Japanese as they treated European prisoners, and in some cases much worse. Bizarrely, at the same time as they abused Indians, the Japanese also sought to recruit them to their cause to fight against the British, into an organization later called the Indian National Army.
As the war progressed and Britain saw its ranks depleted, it also began to draw increasingly on Indian reserves, leaving the Asian country unguarded. It was at this time that rebel factions sought to free themselves from brutal British colonialism and aligned themselves with Japan to attack Burma in 1944. After numerous and violent battles that spilled blood on the soil of that country, the Japanese managed to enter and impart their violent methods on the population. Once Imperial Japan managed to plant its flag in the Andaman Islands, Burma, Malaysia, and Singapore, they then continued on to India and Pakistan. Thousands of people were displaced from their homes, and those who ended up in the hands of the army became slaves who were abused in every possible way. From beatings to the most perverse sexual degradation, everything was valid on the sadistic menu of the Third Reich's ally. It is estimated that, in total, some 40,000 Indian men were taken prisoner. A large part joined the Japanese collaborationist army, driven by the desire to fight against British colonization. Those who rejected this proposal were sent to installations scattered throughout the Pacific. For those who became prisoners, an endless horror began on their long journey to the Japanese military centers. In a report published in newspapers of the time, a survivor recalled that on their journey, more than 2,000 men were packed like sardines in the lower part of a transport ship. They were crowded together, without air to breathe, without food or water. Every 2 or 3 days they were thrown a ration of putrid food that they had to fight for. Those who were not fortunate enough to get a bite knew that they would soon faint from lack of food. Many died during this wild odyssey.
The Indian prisoners were later transferred to a camp at Kuala Belait, a small town in Brunei, where they were incarcerated until June 1945 under the command of a Lieutenant Yamaguchi.
In these regions, there were cases of cannibalism, as well as random murders aimed at decimating the population. It is said that prisoners from labor camps were separated from their companions and taken to hunting grounds, where they were live targets for young soldiers to practice their marksmanship. It was a sadistic game that usually culminated with a pile of corpses of Indian citizens. Those who did not bleed to death on the ground were finished off with bayonet blows, like wild animals. Presumably, these corpses were then incorporated into the officers' diet as part of a ritual of projection of power and authority over the conquered peoples. However, the greatest indication of these atrocities came to light after the conflict. It was a cable sent on April 2, 1946, by an Indian correspondent in Melbourne who received direct information from the editorial office of the newspaper, The Times of India. The short message was about the sentencing of General Hisata Tomiyasu, who was found guilty of the deaths of 14 innocent citizens, as well as of committing acts of torture and cannibalism in Wewak, New Guinea. His sentence was death by hanging, a minor price to pay for the savage acts he was responsible for. In addition to the journalistic record, there are also words from survivors of that hell. Let's hear the testimony of Indian soldier Havildar Changdi Ram, witness to a nightmarish vision.
Without any warning, the Japanese began a program of cannibalization of their Indian prisoners. Ram first witnessed an incident of cannibalism on the 12th of November 1944, when a Kempeitai officer beheaded a recently captured Allied pilot. "I saw this from behind a tree," recalled Ram, who then witnessed an appalling act of butchery take place as the Japanese soldiers present began to render the young pilot's body into food.
Ram still remembers the smell of human flesh cooking before the hungry eyes of a group of soldiers. The conflict had escalated to unimaginable limits. India was a cauldron of rivalries and opposing positions, while tens of thousands of soldiers from that country fought against the Axis with honor. Others advocated their independence from the tyrannical order of Great Britain, even if that meant collaborating with Japan. Unfortunately, the role that these nations played during World War II and the sacrifice they made to contain the Japanese Empire within the limits of Asia is often forgotten. It is known that, under orders from high-ranking officers, medical personnel of the Imperial Army took part in the inspection and execution of hundreds of prisoners so that their flesh could be consumed. According to internal documents, it is presumed that there was a preference for certain parts of the human anatomy, such as the liver, which was considered a delicacy. In many cases, the consumption of people was mixed with old superstitions that spoke of an increase in strength and health of those who devour another human. Of course, these were absurd theories based on old myths, perhaps used to justify the horrors committed by the Japanese force. Experts who have studied Japanese crimes in the deep Pacific theorize that the consumption of prisoners could be understood as a dark projection of power, superiority, and authority. If we add to this that the military organization of Japan was strongly vertical and demanded blind obedience and absolute sacrifice from men, it is understandable that they were open to committing these aberrations. Few armies have the dark and nefarious reputation of having committed cannibalism with their enemies. There is no greater humiliation and act of contempt than that of murdering and cutting up the flesh to transform the hated person into a succulent meal to share as a celebratory feast. The stories of what happened in the Pacific still horrify historians and researchers who seek to shed light on the many mysteries that remain. Documents such as those found by Tanaka are essential to put together the pieces of that nauseating puzzle that is World War II. Almost 80 years after its end, its events still make your skin crawl and your blood run cold. Thus, we come to the end of this chapter full of horrendous stories about some of the most savage crimes. If you want to know more about these dark episodes, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications on our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.